without further ado, I think we can start, and I'll give the floor to Ha-Joon Chang, of course, from very well-known economist from the University of Cambridge, who is going to be our chair for the first panel in this session and also introduce the special. Ha-Joon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antonio. Welcome everyone to this launch event of a special issue that I have edited with Antonio. Well, the reason why we organized this special issue is somehow production, which was at the heart of economics, has disappeared from economics. I mean, of course, there is that kind of that very schematic, production function, which passes for production. But when you think about it, production was at the heart of economics from the beginning. What was the first chapter that Adam Smith ever wrote? It wasn't about the market. It wasn't about finance. It wasn't about the agriculture. It was about the factory, because for him, what was happening on the shop floor in factories was at the heart of this socio-economic transformation that was happening, which later kind of gave birth to a totally new economic system called capitalism. And yeah, the classical economists that after the Smith and the Marxist economists were very much aware of the importance of production in shaping our lives, not just our kind of economy and our society. So that all these Smithian and Marxian theories of stages of production, the stages of development, But unfortunately, with the rise of neoclassical economics and Austrian economics in the late 19th century, the so-called marginal revolution, the focus of economics has come to be exchange, the market, and that even though there was that Keynesian counter to that marginal revolution, Keynes was also that focused on the domain of demand and finance, and of course, very important things, but that production was still missing there. There were, of course, a couple of Keynesian scholars like Kalecki and Caldo who paid attention to production, but it was largely missing. And then we had a period when production came back to central economics, at least in relation to developing countries, because the so-called development economics, the Kuznets, the Hishman, Middle, all these people, they were writing about production again, because they basically understood that the poverty in what we now call the global south was that basically problem that emanated from the weakness in the domain of production. And they were writing about how this domain could be transformed by using the linkages and some of the new concepts that didn't exist in the older productionist discourse of Smith, Marx, and so on. And then they discussed how that's going to, Kuznets was very important there. How the transformation in the domain of production is going to affect the rest of society. Unfortunately, this new discovery of production in economics was set back with the so-called neoliberal counter-revolution since the 1980s, and basically problem of development has been reduced to poverty reduction, palliative care, basically. And the recent the receipt of Nobel Prize by Duflo and Banerjee is that probably the apogee of that trend. Now, I and Antonio thought that it's about time that we brought production back into development discourse, and were very fortunate to collect quite a number of excellent scholars to contribute to this special issue. And I'm very glad that, grateful that all these wonderful people have joined us in our endeavor to refocus economics, not just development economics, but especially development economics. So we have collected several articles in this volume. We have divided the sessions into something more theoretical, but and something more thematic. But this division is largely kind of artificial. You know, most of the articles do have very significant empirical dimensions. Even mainly empirical papers have very interesting and important theoretical contributions to make. So, I mean, please don't think that papers belonging to the first panel is are somehow more theoretical, and the second panel is made up of only empirical papers. In this first panel, I would introduce you to the 4 speakers. So we have, first of all, Maria Savona, who's written this paper, Revisiting High Development Theory, to explain upgrading prospects in the business services, global value chain. We have Fiona, excuse me, Fiona Tregenna, who is, well, representing her 2 co-authors, the paper titled Do Productive Capabilities Affect Export Performance? Evidence from African Firms. And then we have Mateus Labrunie, who together with me and Antonio have co-authored this paper on the digital industrialization. We were originally going to have Spencer Hansen, one of the editors of the journal, but unfortunately Spencer has fallen ill. So I have proposed that Antonio joins this panel to talk about our paper with sorry, Isabel Estevez, discussing the missing dimensions of the human capabilities approach. So without further ado, let me invite the panelists to give a very short presentation and of their papers, and some reflections on how he or she sees the theoretical and empirical developments in this very important but neglected field. So the first speaker I would like to invite is Maria Savona from University of Sussex. And given the importance of that brief period in the 50s and 60s, when we had a revival of productionist thinking on the issues of development and in economics in general, I think Maria's paper talking about the linkages and the intermediate demands is highly relevant. So let me ask Maria to speak for 7 minutes so that we can have some discussion later.
Okay, well, thanks, Ha-Joon. And I'd like to thank Antonio and Ha-Joon for the opportunity to contribute to this great special issue. And I've been responding to the call of revisiting the classics. So, and also I shall mention that I started this line of research a few years ago, and I have also developed empirically with a few co-authors, so Filippo Bontadini, Valentina Meliciani, and Javier Lopez Gonzalez at UACT Trade. And so part of the reflections are on to them as well. So the main aim in this paper was to trying to explain upgrading perspectives, upgrading opportunities, or diversification opportunities in business services. Now, so business services, especially in business service global value chain. So to try to revisit these classics to understand a modern phenomenon and new forms of trade and a new forms of trade of intermediates, which business services are. Particularly to reflect whether this represents uneffective opportunities for development, or whether there are some hidden traps, specialization traps that might be we need to unpack or take into account. So what the idea, what is proposed in the paper is an hypothesis that I call a Hishman-Linder hypothesis, which combines the contribution of two classics, Hishman and Linder, respectively, from the development theory and trade theory. Now, I would say both of them had a particular view on the role of the first one. So Hishman had a particular view on the value of interdependence of the structure of the economy, and particularly view some of the sectors as more inducive of development pathways, particularly manufacturing at the time. And the structure is therefore then can explain some patterns of development and also some patterns of trade specialization. Linder, on the other hand, was particularly an outsider at this time, because he was looking at trying to explain patterns of trade based on what he called the representative domestic demand of a country. So he had a particular view on the value of scale of a particular structure. So the combination of the two would be to understand the role of some sectors that represent a particular valuable intermediate demand, in case the manufacturing sector, that also explain why some countries then specialize and trade specialize in particular sectors, specifically business services. Now, business services have a specific role compared to manufacturing, because this is what I put forward in the paper, is the idea that they do not necessarily represent a deindustrialization pattern, but are the intrinsic component of manufacturing production, because they complement a production from the intermediate. So they represent a crucial intermediate input for manufacturing. But intriguingly, I also present in the paper the idea that they might represent a useful diversification pattern, a backward diversification pattern, when we consider countries specializing in natural resources. So what I also put forward in the paper is that the idea that manufacturing needs to be at the core of development as the main thread line of the special issue. But also when countries are specialized in natural resources, this might not necessarily be a curse, because there might be an opportunity to diversify backward into activities that might complement this specialization from high, providing knowledgeable inputs, for example. So this doesn't necessarily mean diversifying towards low-tech manufacturing, forward low-tech manufacturing, but having more opportunities to developing towards backward participation. So these ideas, so theoretically, but also from the policy perspective, implies that first of all, the classic economics has revisited opportunities to explain emerging phenomena such as international fragmentation of production and global value chain, have an intrinsic value in understanding this phenomenon, but also it helps us understanding what are the policy implications for that. Because ideally, focusing on domestic capabilities and domestic structure is, for me, a new form of infant industry protection, if you want. So it's a new way of directing industrial policy at the domestic level to allow new forms of beneficial forms of entering into global value chains. And this is a different forms of infant industry, because rather than a protection sort of usual way of looking at, there is an intrinsic actively promoting of domestic capabilities before entering or before trade specializing in particular sectors. And this is basically, this is sort of trying to square the circle of looking at new forms of internationalization and protecting domestic capabilities to be able to benefit from these new forms of international production. And I think this is more or less what I had to say, and I'm looking forward to reactions and questions from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Yeah, no, I think your paper is really Hishmanian in the sense that you know, he always looks for kind of sideways and indirect route and backward loop, and that your paper that very much takes his theories one step forward by doing exactly the kind of thing that he was such a master at. A lot of very interesting theoretical potential there. Okay, I mean, we could talk about Maria's paper for 2 hours, but since we have limited time, shall we move on to Fiona? Fiona, please.
Thanks, Ha-Joon, and greetings to everybody from South Africa. Here in South Africa, it's a holiday today. We are celebrating Freedom Day, which is the date of the first democratic elections in 1994. But despite it being a holiday, I'm really happy to join this event and happy to have contributed to the special issue. Congratulations to Ha-Joon and Antonio. I think it's a really great contribution. I'm going to just kick off with a really brief overview of our article, co-authored between myself, Elvis Avenio, and Erica Kramer-Mbula, all from University of Johannesburg. Then just going to make a couple of brief comments on the productionist agenda, especially as it relates to developing countries, and then to link productive capabilities, which is the focus of our contribution with this agenda, which I think is the thematic focus of the special issue. Yeah, so as I said, our article focuses on productive capabilities among African firms, and specifically the effects of these capabilities on firms' export performance. Obviously being well recognized that firms, that export performance is crucial for growth and development in African economies, and that tend to be underperforming in this regard in Africa relative to other regions. So this takes a firm level focus to looking at export performance. Broadly, in terms of our perspective in the article on productive capabilities, and drawing on the existing literature on this, I think it's recognized that productive capabilities develop through a long process of learning in the production process. And through this continuous learning, new productive capabilities or strengthened productive capabilities can enhance firms' productive potential, possibilities, and prosperity. From the existing firm level evidence, capabilities are understood as strategic and tacit internal resources of firms. And through these firms that have superior capabilities are able through those to perform better both in national and in international markets, as is the case, as is the focus in our own article. So these kind of capabilities provide opportunities for firms to gain a competitive advantage, in particular because these sort of capabilities are not easily shared or copied. And particularly of relevance for developing countries, they also provide opportunities for latecomer firms to catch up and to overcome competitive challenges by enabling firms to venture into the production of new, sophisticated, more complex products. So what we do in our article is we use recent firm level data from the World Bank Enterprise Survey across 29 African countries. And we build new multidimensional indicators of productive capabilities, which are conceptualized here as a combination of technological and production capabilities. So to measure technological capabilities, we use variables such as R&D, innovation, fixed assets, licenses, and ownership. Whereas for production capabilities, we use variables such as formal training, labor regulations, workforce education, a broader measure of education and certification. And we estimate a censored regression model, and we use instrumentalization to address possible endogeneity. In terms of our results, we find that both technological and production capabilities are very important drivers of firms' direct export performance, and measured specifically in terms of export intensity. And at a policy level, we see that the findings as underscoring the importance of policies that support the strengthening of productive capabilities in African countries. So these perhaps require targeted policies that support firms in learning to develop and to adopt new knowledge, to recombine old knowledge, and to acquire skills to transform the mix of offered products and services. This is likely to require appropriate mix of policies, including innovation and technology policies, industrial policy, education and training policy, integrated with other policy domains that are relevant to building firm-level productive capabilities. In terms of the novelty of our study, we see it as lying firstly in the construction of new measures of productive capabilities that recognize their complexity and their multidimensional nature, something which Antonio has been drawing attention to in his own pioneering work in this area. When we're trying to practicalize this with the development of these new multidimensional indicators. And a second broad contribution is that, to the best of our knowledge, this is the first empirical analysis of the subject at the firm level for a large sample of firms across African countries. So that's an overview of our paper. I'll now just turn to some broader comments around the theme of the special issue, and I think the link between productive capabilities and that theme. And these are just my own personal comments, not implicating my co-authors. So maybe the first reflection is that I think in some ways it seems absurd that there is even a case for a renewed focus on production and development, which is the theme of the special issue. It seems crazy that there should even need to be such a theme and such a special issue dedicated to this. And the fact that this special issue is indeed timely and relevant, and that it contributes to filling this gap, is in itself a poor reflection on the state of economics. As Ha-Joon said, production really lies at the heart of economics. And when we think about the various dimensions of this, what is produced, how is it produced, how much is produced, where is it produced, by whom is it produced, for whom, under whose control, and so on. This is absolutely central to economics. And of course, by production here, we're not only referring to production of things, but production in the broadest sense, also including services. So when we think about the various, what's sometimes called the spheres of production, distribution, and consumption, these are effectively so inextricably linked that only in quite a limited sense can we really think of these as separate spheres. Linking this to the broad development project, I think probably everyone here on this call would, I guess, recognize the importance of structural change as key to catching up and to development. And that this entails a transformation of the productive structure of developing economies. So we can see production as playing a constitutive role in the development process. So linking then this broad kind of conceptualization of the productionist agenda, which is the theme of this special issue, and trying to connect this with productive capabilities, which is our own focus in an applied sense in our article. We can see that the advancement of firm level productive capabilities as part of the micro foundations of structural transformation, which perhaps was a bit neglected relatively in some of the earliest literature on structural transformation, I think. So a central part of structural transformation is obviously a change in the sectoral structure of economies, which links with the push towards industrialization. but it also involves upgrading across sectors. So it's not just a change in sectoral structure, but it's an upgrading of firms in all sectors of the economy. And this again connects with the issue of productive capabilities. This also links closely with learning and the centrality of learning to the catching up and development process. So not only are productive capabilities developed in part through learning, including learning by doing, but we can see individual and meso-level productive capabilities as an integral part of broader learning by doing. Also important here, I think, is the recognition of the—
Fiona, one more minute, yeah.
The collective role of productive capabilities. And this is critical for catching up, for the catching up process, and helping us to understand why some countries catch up and others fall further behind. Lastly, I would just urge an interactive, or we might say a dialectical understanding of the relationship between firm level productive capabilities and the more macroeconomic dimensions of the development process. So for instance, while on the one hand, we need the upgrading of firm level productive capabilities in order to enable high rates of investment and to extract the benefits of investment for development. At the same time, I think we can't lose sight of the macro imperatives. So we should also guard against an exclusive micro focus. So the basics of development, like having sufficiently high rates of investment at the macro level, do still matter. And we really needed an iterative understanding of the relationship between these. Thanks.
Thank you, Fiona. Yeah, I think that your paper is very much in the spirit of Adam Smith and Marx. You know, these are people who try to link what was going on the shop floor, the rise of the factory system and machinery manufacture and so on, with the broader social and economic structural changes. Thank you. Mateus, next.
Thanks, Ha-Joon. Yes, really happy to be here and talking with great scholars about these fascinating issues. So my name is Mateus Labrunie, and me together with Andreoni and Ha-Joon Chang, we wrote the paper on the challenges and opportunities for digital industrialization in developing countries. And this issue of technology in economic development has been studied by many authors in the economics discipline, going back to, as Ha-Joon was saying, Adam Smith, Marx, Schumpeter, and more recently to the new Schumpeterian authors. So the contribution of our paper here would be to follow in this tradition of the study of the technology in the economic development, and to try to unpack what are the characteristics of the emerging technological paradigm, right? Often referred to as the fourth industrial revolution, industry 4.0, digital transformation, advanced manufacturing, anyway, many names. And try to understand what this means for economic development, especially for developing countries. The motivation here is also that many authors have pointed out that moments of fast technological transformations are windows of opportunity for development, right? Given that the technology is new to everyone, some of the entry barriers would be lowered in these periods, right? Also because incumbent firms might be stuck with the old technologies and have a lot of inertia there. So there are many opportunities for new entrants, right? So what we found is that first, we need a better understanding of the nature of the fourth industrial revolution, right? And what we found is that individually, the technologies are not that new. But what's really distinctive about them is the high level of technology fusion that's occurring, right? So this means the combination of different technologies from distinct fields of knowledge into complex technological systems, right? So in a single solution, it's common to find a combination of sensors, actuators, connectivity devices, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, etc. So one of the conclusions then of our paper is that what is needed today is not so much the the development of individual technological capabilities, but more the development of what we call foundational capabilities, which would be the capabilities, the production, technological, and organizational capabilities that would allow you to learn this myriad of technologies and combine them and implement them in production. What this means for developing countries is that before they can start to think of making the leap into the fourth industrial revolution, they would need this long and gradual process of development of these foundational capabilities. And that's why the name of the paper is Natura non facit saltus, nature does not make leaps. And then we moved on to provide evidence of the impacts of this technological fusion and of the individual technologies of the fourth industrial revolution in 10 productive sectors. And we have shown that for the countries that have these foundational capabilities already in place, several opportunities for leapfrogging then are being opened, right? I won't have time here to go through these impacts in detail, of course, but just to give a few examples, they have impacts in R&D and pre-manufacturing activities, such as the use of virtual reality and augmented reality technologies in product development, 3D printing for faster prototyping. There are also impacts in process innovations, such as the so-called smart and connected production, right? Cyber-physical systems or the smart factory model, where basically everything is connected and machines are increasingly autonomous and communicating with one another. There are also impacts in product innovations, so smart products, such as smart wearable devices, also smart home appliances and smart vehicles, right? Such as drones, autonomous tractors, and even possibly autonomous automobiles, right? And there are also impacts in supply chain management, right? And the key point here is that now there are increasingly an increased ability to track and monitor products both upstream, so tracking components, raw materials, and also downstream, so delivery to the consumer and monitoring of the product usage by consumers. So the important thing to know here is that these opportunities are being opened not only in high-tech sectors, but also in the sectors that are typical of developing countries, such as agriculture and farming, extractive industries, and also textile and apparel manufacturing. And finally, in the last part of the paper, we discussed what does this mean for industrial policy, right? And here we highlighted the importance of understanding the different roles of different sectors in technological development, right? So some sectors are technology push, such as, ICTs, right? Information and communication technologies and capital goods. And some sectors are demand pull in the sense that they are mostly users of these new technological solutions, right? Such as consumer goods, basic inputs, pharmaceuticals, etc. So for technology push sectors, the policy should prioritize the formation of ecosystems, right? Which would exactly bring together these traditionally separated actors to take advantage of these technology fusion opportunities. And for the demand pull sectors, on the other hand, the priority should be on technology diffusion policies, reducing the cost and the risk of adopting these technological solutions. And so the interaction between these push and pull dynamics is what may allow developing countries to create and develop successful players adapted to their local needs, and could eventually then create internationally competitive actors.
Mateus,
So
can you try to wind up?
Yeah, just to conclude, the fourth industrial revolution is most likely will make it even harder for developing countries to catch up, because it has not only to develop the individual capabilities, but these more broad foundational capabilities. But it also creates many opportunities, and thus industrial policy has to be grounded in the reality of these digital technologies, and even smarter now in climbing the technology ladder than it has been. Thank you, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you, Mateus. Okay, we are beginning to run out of time. So can I ask Antonio to briefly introduce our paper with Isabel on capabilities approach, and also that John has kindly agreed to make some comments before we open the floor to the general audience. Okay, Antonio.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone. I'll be very brief. This was not in the program, in the plan, but in fact was one of the seminal ideas that created space for this special issue. In a previous paper with Ha-Joon, we were looking back at exactly the moment in time where production was going out of fashion, and we were trying to identify, as already Alice Amstead, in fact, in a similarly titled paper did a few years ago in the early 90s, why production was out of the development discourse, has lost that centrality. And of course, for those of you who are working in development, we have seen not simply the disappearance of production, but the emergence of paradigms that have been very influential. And one of those is not simply related to the neoliberal paradigm, but also a certain view of development, which is very much focused on a sort of humanist idea of development. If you think about the role that the capability approach, which emerged, of course, with the work, the seminal work of Amartya Sen and later Martha Nussbaum and others, was and has been and still remain a key foundation of not only a large literature on understanding development and underdevelopment, but also quite influential in shaping the narrative at the level of probably the most well-known report of UN, which is the Human Development Report. So in this paper, what we tried to do was actually to look at what was missing in an emerging narrative, which was encapsulated in a science capability approach, and how was possible to actually bring back some of the insights from the classical development economists into this approach and try to understand why is that this approach missed fundamentally two dimensions. And one is what we call the collective and the other one, the productive dimension. Now, if we think about the capability approach, the traditional sense capability approach, already in the early 2000s, there was a large debate around and critiques around its individualistic nature. Great scholars like Francis Stewart, Peter Evans and others proposed alternative concept of capabilities. But this concept didn't really move into the literature. They didn't become mainstream into the literature. Concepts like social capabilities, which in fact already Moses Abramovich had introduced early on, or group capabilities, were sort of introduced to recognize that the beings and doings of individuals are, of course, an end of development, but there are also a number of collective capabilities and functionings that are relevant and could be actually given the same type of status as an end, not simply a mean in development. And we try to address this first dimension of the collective, because we believe that when we look at production, it's impossible to think about production as an individual effort. And this is the idea of division of labor, the idea that fundamentally production is about organization, it's about collectives who are coordinating their effort with a certain type of purpose, is very much at the core of what Ha-Joon was referring in the very beginning. It's not that Martha Nussbaum or Sen don't talk about work in some cases, but the majority of the time is not about how production and the involvement in productive collective activities generates and constitutes people. It's more about how instrumental these activities are to other valuable beings and doings in the capability approach. Now, we try to explore in this paper why is that despite people have started engaging with this problem, the production dimension has remained uncovered. And one of the things that we highlight is the fact that the development literature, in particular, those who have been looking at different ideas of capabilities, have in fact missed the opportunity to integrate these frameworks. I'm pleased that Maria is here because Nick von Tunselman a few years ago wrote something around exactly how we can combine the capability approach a la Sanjay Alal, a la Jorge Katz, all that developmental micro literature with actually a literature which is inspired by this humanist perspective. So what we do is to reflect on how, in fact, there is a missed opportunity here, which is the opportunity of thinking about all these alternative capability approaches. And in the case of course, the theory of the firm and production, we cannot miss the role that Edith Penrose played in shaping our understanding of the dynamics of growth and the dynamics, collective dynamics of the firm, and how these approaches can provide a framework that both pursue these humanist type of goals of development, but at the same time understand not just instrumental, but the constitutive role that production plays in how we understand even development. And this is, I think, a fundamental point, that what we aspire to as development, as freedoms in the Amartya Sen's language, it's actually partially determined by how the material conditions change in our environment, in the place in which we work. So the aspiration that people had to certain freedom is partially the result of that process of productive transformation. And as a result of that, we need to think about this constitutive dimension, not simply an instrumental one. Very final point that I will make, just to also give time to John to comment on this first session, is that this is not a purely theoretical discussion. It's not an attempt to simply engage intellectually with some issues. These type of problems have very strong implication. If we think about how the Human Development Report started engaging in the Human Development Index with the idea of inequality only in 2011, so 20 years after that was introduced, it's symptomatic of this problem of not understanding the collective dimension of the problem, because inequality, of course, it's not an individual dimension of freedom. It's about interdependence. It's about how you are part of a collectivity. And in this paper, what we do is to try, and this is very much drawing on some of Isabel, our co-author Isabel Estevet's work, looking at how literally the human development discourse within the UNDP has evolved over the years, and how there has been a number of missed opportunities to capture the collective and the productive dimension of that. I'll stop there and I'll go back to Ha-Joon. Thanks.
Should I just take over, Antonio?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Antonio. John, may I invite you to give us some comments? Yeah.
I hope you can hear me, because I'm doing this via my phone now.
We can hear you very well.
Okay, thank you. First of all, let me just, on behalf of the European Journal of Development Research, thank both Ha-Joon and Antonio for this great special issue. I have to say the quality is very high, and the topic is very timely, even though we have been discussing these issues for many years. I think we have a huge or large readership for this type of special issue. And we can already see now a lot of my students are currently using the papers already to generate ideas. So I think it's going to generate a lot of new ideas, thoughts, and maybe bring us back on track regarding production economies. I will just, because it was actually Spencer who was supposed to provide comments for this, but I will divide it into three comments for Maria, Fiona, and Mateus. So I'll take one each, because I will just bring us back to Maria's paper. And there is this interesting result that natural resource industries are likely to be part of this business services global value chain. So what I would maybe like us to think a little bit about, and maybe Maria can comment on it if we have time, is whether we should divide this type of analysis into higher value-added business services versus lower value-added business services. Some of the work I've been doing, but that is in Ghana as well, I've been looking at whether the natural resource sector is actually generating higher value-added business services. And as far as I can see, this is not really the case. whereas manufacturing is more likely to be linked to higher value-added business services. So if we could think about this in the connection to this, I think this could be beneficial going forward. Moving to Fiona's paper, I think this discussion about productive capabilities is something that we have been doing for quite a while now. We also have other scholars looking at this in terms of trade theory and so forth. But I think the interesting part to elaborate on a little bit would be to how do we divide it into these manager skills and worker skills, and can we distinguish between those in terms of defining capabilities of a firm? So I like this idea of digging deep into the firm level data, but then we also have to say something about the social capital, the interconnectedness between managers and workers. Does it work differently in different sectors? And as far as I could read from Fiona's paper, there's not a lot to say on this using the type of data you can get from the World Bank enterprise data. Here you may need linked employee data, and this is just common for Fiona working on South Africa. I think you have access to this linked employee data that is available now in the South African context. So I guess there will be a lot of the new work coming out, at least in the South African context on this. Finally, for Mateus, I think it's very interesting. And I think the last part you mentioned about that we can also apply your thoughts to agriculture in developing countries. I think that is an important issue to raise, because the comparative advantage of most developing countries is the cheap labor. And how to see that in connection with the fourth industrial revolution, I think it's going to be key. You cannot discuss these two things independently. I think it has to be discussed in combination. I attended this Richard Baldwin's lecture in Bangkok a year ago. I think it was the UNU Wider Conference in Bangkok in September. 2 years ago now. I forgot about COVID. I lost a year. Sorry about that. And he was also discussing these things. And I think the interconnectedness to his work is likely to be beneficial when you read the paper that Mateus has been involved in. So I would encourage you to link a little bit more closely to that type of literature that Richard Baldwin is also referring to, and the labor capabilities of developing countries. So that was my 2 cents on these 3 papers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Yeah, we have quite a few questions. Mihai, Zoran, Pedro, Philip, Gwendolina. So we cannot really kind of deal with these questions individually. I think that one common theme among these questions is how should industrial policy be designed according to what you are trying to achieve? I mean, what kind of policies do you need for technological catch up versus technological leapfrogging? Do you need vertical industrial policy or horizontal industrial policy? Another Mihai asked can you give us an example of successful creation of innovation ecosystem? I mean, obviously that cases like South Korea and Taiwan are the obvious examples, and probably Kunli will have something to say about that later. So that's one common theme. Another is that what is the implication for broader kind of international initiatives? I mean, okay, we accept that. This is mainly from Philip Neuberg. let's accept your arguments, but what does it mean for redesigning the international system, redesigning the international aid policy and so on? So I think that's the second theme. Oh, there's another one about labor union. Oh gosh, we very much running out of time here, and I want each panelist to have like 1 or 2 minutes to react to what have been said. Yes. Yeah, and I think that another common theme was how, you know, the changing kind of the evolution of the global value chain and the changes that follow from the COVID pandemic. How are they going to affect the future the development, and more specifically it is. So I have been able to summarize the question only very, very briefly, and I'll give each panelist 1, maybe maximum 2 minutes to react to, well, whatever was said regarding your own paper or some general remark. So let's start with Maria.
Thanks, Ha-Joon. Yeah, I'd like to, if I can, pick quickly on what Antonio was saying, that around the foundation of Nick's perspective on this. And I think it's relevant and might also serve as a general response to some of the questions. So the idea of industrial policy for development should first and foremost identify opportunities and direction for structural transformation, something that the private sector wouldn't be able to do on its own if not directed. That's overall the general view. What, for example, Nick was talking about, and this goes back to Antonio's point, was that ideally for shaping industrial policy for development would be more like a sort of identifying what is the best governance of network alignment. So these different actors that contribute to the development pathways. And this is very much within an innovation system perspective, but more from the perspective of aligning different incentives of groups of actors towards a common goal of having development pathways and structural transformations that are beneficial to the countries. So this is just a general point on the overall discussion. More specifically on John's issue on the natural resource sector. I mean, indeed, natural resources is a very peculiar one, and I consider to be within the production sphere that Antonio and Ha-Joon put forward in their introduction. The idea here is to identify again a more beneficial direction of development and diversification, and what I consider to be a proficiency one, so moving backward towards business, high value added business service that can serve the sector. This has very much to do with also technological opportunities that are intrinsic in the natural resource sector. And there are examples in countries, and the cliche one is Chilean and the work that has been done on the knowledge intensive mining sector. So something that has been developed complementary to the extractive industries. Maybe in this context that we can open another discussion on the sustainability of this, but I don't want to open it now. But ideally, they can also help into identifying a direction of development that is based on the endowment that can actually ideally move into a more sustainable direction of that particular industry and diversify into something that can then become a competitive advantage for that particular country. In this sense, I was putting forward the idea that it might not necessarily be a curse and can actually open up opportunities to move into a more sustainable direction of development. I hope it makes sense.
All right, I have to stop you there. Yeah.
Sure. No, I was about to stop.
I invite Fiona to. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think because of time, I'll just comment on Gwendolina's question, which was posed directly on our paper. Part of it was asking about whether the analysis is across sectors or for a specific sector, and whether we pick up differences by country or whatever. Yeah, it is across sectors. So in our data, we have firms in 33 industries, which we then group into manufacturing, construction, services, and then separate from that, transport, storage, and communications, and IT. And we have both industry and country controls in our specifications. We haven't in this paper specifically analyzed differences, let's say by region within Africa, or low versus middle income, or by sector. But I think these would certainly be interesting extensions, because we might find that the relationship between productive capabilities and export performance varies by sector, by groups of country, and so on. And I think the second part of Gwendolina's question is how we expect, if at all, the relationship to change in future, taking into account GVCs and COVID and so on. For me, it's difficult to see productive capabilities becoming less significant. If anything, I think we would probably expect them to be more significant with the integration of firms within GVCs in terms of affecting the location of firms within GVCs, and the potential for upgrading of all sorts, functional, product and process, and so on within GVCs. And in relation to COVID, some current works are separate from this paper between myself and Carmen Naidu from UMass Amherst. We're looking at the survival of firms and the performance of firms, and how firms are hit by COVID. And we, as part of that, we're looking at productive capabilities, types of indicators of firms. And we find that the kinds of firm characteristics associated with productive capabilities, as one might expect, are important determinants of both firm survival pre to during COVID, as well as the extent to which they have been hit by COVID in their performance. Yeah. Okay, let me leave it there. Ha-Joon is nudging me to wrap up.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of time, so I'll give Mateus 1 or 2 minutes, and then we'll have to move to the next panel. Mateus?
Yes, thank you. I'll be very quick. I was going to comment on the catching up versus leapfrogging question, but I saw that actually Kunli already answered that in the chat, so I'm going to skip that one. I was regarding the question about whether sectoral policies or horizontal policies are necessary in the context of Industry 4.0. I would just make a brief comment that I believe it still makes sense to talk about productive sectors, and that's even why we use that in our paper. But I believe what changes with Industry 4.0 might be the idea of technological sectors, and the fact that these are being fused. Therefore, the separation between technological sectors might not make much sense anymore. And so this should be more viewed together. And I also thank John Wren for the suggestion of Balding. And regarding this discussion of Industry 4.0 together with agriculture, I think that's very key. And in our paper, we talk about this dynamics between the technology push and demand pull. And I think that's exactly where it fits, like the demands of agriculture being an incentive for the development of solutions adapted to the local needs, and possibly spurring new technological solutions out of that. So yeah, I'll leave it at that, and let's go.
Yeah, Mateus, I'll have to stop you there. Yeah, so thank you very much for the panelists for this first panel. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Antonio to start the second panel.
Thanks so much, Ha-Joon. I'm conscious we designed this as a tour de force, so it's going to be quite, of course, many of these topics would require much more time. But we thought, as Ha-Joon mentioned, to have the second panel, which was going to move directly to a number of emerging topics in this field. And for many of the contributions, as you will see, the idea of understanding the organization of production at the international level, or what people call global value chain, global production network, was an important, if you want, organizing principle to understand what is changing, in what direction many of these sectoral value chains are going, what are the dimensions that are relevant for understanding, upgrading, understanding the capacity of learning along these value chains. In fact, if we look at the very last World Development Report, which came out a few days ago on trading for development in the age of global value chains, there is an increasing emphasis in understanding if the huge emergence of value chains has delivered the type of expected or hoped outcome for development. And a number of contributions from a number of leading scholars in this field have been pointing out, in some cases, if you want, a very positive narrative about the opportunities of GVC integration, while others have also pointed out how this actually, it's not an automatic process. There can be also lots of cases in which value chain do not deliver the type of structural transformation we would like to see. And the reasons for that are very diverse. So the contribution we're going to discuss now are going to be very much trying to engage with this topic. And I would like to ask Professor Kyun Lee to be the first one to present some of the insights from his paper on global value chains, industrial policy and industrial upgrading, where with the focus on the automotive sector, with a comparative analysis between Malaysia, Thailand, and China, also in relation to the Korean experience. Kyun, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you. It's great to be in this panel today, also to be in this special issue. Okay. As introduce my paper in this special issue about with the title GVC Industrial Policy and Upgrading in East Asia. And we are comparing automobile sectors in China, Malaysia, and Thailand, with Korea's case serving as a reference point. Okay. And our motivating puzzle or question is that first, why Malaysia failed despite of active industrial policies? They failed basically in terms of the promoting local brand. Okay. Proton finally sold to Geely from China. Then how about Thailand? Is it really succeeding as argued by Baldwin, despite it's still under the Japanese ownership? And thirdly, how about China? How and why is China succeeding? Is it owing to industrial policy or is it despite industrial policies? Okay, so those are our motivating questions, and we discussed these countries' upgrading or success in terms of 3 measures based on GVC. 2 measures of backward participation in GVC, and 1 measures of forward linkage to GVC. Okay, and thereby we're trying to say what are the requirements to be successful with industrial policy, especially local content requirement. Okay, and our goal is to show that you need 3 factors to be successful in industrial policies. First, local ownership. Okay, so unless we have eventually promote local ownership, you cannot be fully successful. So that in the sense, Thailand is only mixed success. Okay, and the second factor is that you got to have a discipline from world market or competition. Without that, you cannot be successful. That's the case of Malaysia. Malaysian local company on almost monopoly, and so they don't have any discipline from world market. That's the source of their failures. Third, you got to have a fundamental effort to build technical capabilities, especially localizing core part, high-tech part. In the case of automobile, the engine and transmission. That's where Malaysia failed, despite they have a local ownership. Okay, so these are our main conclusion. But in doing so, we use the specific measure of GBC. Our first measure is that backward linkage, which is something called FBA, which is share of foreign value added in gross export. So in the case of Korea and China, it has been decreasing for a catching up period. That means decreasing means that you are increasing local value added. Okay, that didn't happen in Thailand. That didn't happen in Malaysia. Only happened in Korea and China. Second measure is the backward linkage 2, which is the share of re-exported intermediate part in your total import. Higher of this value means that you are getting more export oriented. It has been very rapidly increasing in Korea, but not much so in China because China is still domestic market oriented. But it's not increasing either in Thailand. It's increasing in Thailand. So Thailand is successful as an export countries, but that's not the case in Malaysia. Malaysia only focuses on domestic market. Okay. Third measure is forward linkage. And that has been increasing in China and Korea, but not increasing at all in Thailand and Malaysia. So serving as Korea as most successful cases, China is getting similar to Korean pattern in terms of 3 measures out of 3. And Malaysia is failing in any of 3 measures. Thailand is successful only in measure of export orientation. Okay, so the full story is that in terms of 3 factors for successful requirement, and Malaysian failure is that despite local ownership and supportive policies, they don't have any discipline or competition. And so they didn't go for export market and they did not increase domestic value added. Whereas Thailand is only mixed success. They perform better than Malaysia, at least in export orientation, but no local ownership under Japanese ownership. So they are limited in terms of increasing domestic value added. Okay, and they didn't go globalization. Okay, so very low in forward GBC linkages. China, more successful cases, in other words, while protecting local manufacturers through restricting foreign ownership, and government did actively intervene. So based on domestic market discipline, they're able to upgrade. So they're increasing more and more domestic value added, and also for outbound oriented in terms of globalization. They're already setting up the factory abroad, but they're only limited success in terms of export orientation, but they're now going for export market too. Okay, so the lesson is that you got to have local ownership to be a long-term success. Thailand, mixed success, they're very catching up very, very slowly. So there's some limitation. It's not bad, but limited success in terms of increasing degree of domestic value added. Okay, I think that's quick summary of my essential aspect of papers.
Thanks, Kyun. Thanks. That was very dense, but extremely important to emphasize, how complex this integration into value chain is. And of course, your emphasis on ownership, reminds me Eimer and all the work that, foundational in terms of understanding internationalization, transnational corporation, and the role of competition in that space. So thanks so much for that. Of course, one of the issues that in GVC discussion probably has been not so much discussed is the role of competition within value chain and the power exercised in the context of a number of countries, like, for example, South Africa, where the type of distribution in terms of power downstream, upstream along this chain can have a dramatic impact in terms of trajectories of upgrading, not just in terms of the companies, but in terms of the overall country. So I would like to invite Pamela Mondliwa from the Berkeley Research Group, as well the Center for Competition Regulation and Economic Development at the University of Johannesburg, who has contributed a paper on competition, productive capabilities, and structural transformation in South Africa with her co-author Sumaya Goga and Simon Roberts. Pamela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antonio, and good afternoon to everyone. I do have to note that the views expressed here are my own and my co-authors and not that of the Berkeley Research Group. That's just a little disclaimer that I have to give. So greetings from South Africa, also like Fiona, working on a public holiday. As Antonio's outlined, I'm going to give some reflections on the productionist agenda from the perspective of competition. And as he's mentioned, this is drawing from a paper that's in the volume that's co-authored with Sumaya Goga and Simon Roberts, which are colleagues at the Center for Competition Regulation and Economic Development at the University of Johannesburg. So from the perspective of competition, we've been seeing increasing debate on what is the appropriate conceptualization of competition, both in terms of economics, law, and policy in order to address contemporary challenges of economic development. And to give a little bit of context to those that may not be up to date with those debates, competition law has been a part of the market liberalization package that has been promoted across developing countries as a template for achieving economic development. So this is part of the agenda of you just need to get the fundamentals right in order to be able to grow. Here, competition has been premised on the neoclassical model of competition, which privileges static allocative efficiency and largely ignoring production. This market fundamentalist conceptualization privileges exchange and does not address the role of competitive rivalry in terms of spurring investments in accumulating capabilities in order to raise productivity. And it further ignores path dependencies and market conditions such as the size of the economy, concentration levels, and the extent of barriers to entry, and how these factors themselves shape competitive outcomes. It assumes away, all the important factors that we need to understand dynamic competition. An example is that neoclassical framework would assume that anti-competitive conduct such as cartels are a distortion that happen in an otherwise well-functioning market, whereas we know in reality, and especially in small economies like South Africa, that there is entrenched market power and strategic interactions between firms that one would observe in global value chains especially are intrinsic features of a market economies. So if you do not take the time to understand the distribution of power and the various ways in which firms can use that power to balance, to ensure that rents accrue to them, then competition may really miss the boat in terms of outcomes. And so the implication that this template has had, which we observe in South Africa, but is also the case in many other developing countries, is that it's maintained the status quo in terms of economic structure, right? So if the firms that have power were those that were part of the economic structure, so in the instance of South Africa, in 1994, when we became a democracy, because of that power, and then you add on that market liberalization with neoclassical type of competition, you struggle to achieve the diversification that is required in order to achieve long-term growth. By comparison, a focus on production rather than exchange, when you're thinking about competition, requires competition in terms of whether it stimulates or undermines investments by firms to build capabilities for technological progress and engage in learning by doing and development of new products. And what this implies is that you need dynamic efficiencies rather than static efficiencies. And this is in line with what Amson and Singh termed as optimal competition, which is a balance between competition law, antitrust as known in America, and cooperation, which is part of the tools of industrial policy in order to shape a country's productive capabilities. And what optimal competition implies is that there must be sufficient competitive rivalry to reduce inefficiency within large firms, but also sufficient discipline discipline against the exercise of market power, while at the same time spurring investment and innovation. And as such, it embodies a balance of interests consistent with maximizing the long-term rate of industrial growth, taking into account achieving economies of scale, enhanced efficiencies, and optimal use of resources. And what our paper does is that it contributes to this larger discussion by maybe teasing out a few things that we can think about, or a few ways in which we can think about how we could move analysis towards more an optimal competition. So the paper uses two value chains in South Africa, which are quite important for the economy. And the value chains span from minerals all the way to industrial and consumer goods. And in both case studies, there's high concentration in the upstream levels of activities, which result from, amongst a number of other factors, from prior state support. And what we do in the case studies is we review how competition law has grappled with the market power of these firms and how successful that has been in terms of changing the cost of inputs in order to support diversification by downstream firms, as well as also engaging with how industrial policy has supported firms at the various levels of the value chain. And the main takeaway points that come from the paper are in three levels. And the first one, which is linked a bit to what Kyun Lee was talking about earlier, is that optimal competition requires engaging with power along the value chains. This means understanding the vertical relationships and the changes required to ensure that a more constructive relationships are created that will support upgrading of productive capabilities. Here, vertical coordination is essential to support investments in upgrading. The key question is how to grapple with the power of large companies that govern this. And this is not what you often see in competition law, for instance, because it tends to consider what's happening at a discrete level of the market. And where you are looking at vertical relationships, it tends to narrow in too much on one aspect and forgetting that a lot of these strategies that firms would adopt are reinforcing and multiple, and addressing just one issue doesn't resolve the problem in terms of ensuring, for instance, that there's competitively priced inputs to support growth and development of downstream industries. And what we see and observe in South Africa is that there's been a separation of competition law and industrial policy. And what this really does is it handicaps the government in terms of reshaping markets. Because what the tool that's mainly used to address market power is competition, whereas actually using industrial policy, you could support the creation of effective competitors or support domestic firms to becoming more internationally competitive. And another important aspect that seems to be lost in the current approach to competition is the importance of linkages. And here linkages are very important for investments and product development necessary for capabilities. But because we are so worried about competition in discrete particular markets, we tend to not incentivize or support the coordination, even at sometimes vertical levels of firms, in order to bring in new products or to support, to jointly invest in R&D and innovation. And the second point that came out of the case studies was that competition law has really been ineffective in terms of addressing market power when it came to key industrial inputs, the pricing of key industrial inputs in South Africa. The litigious nature of competition law meant time.
Yeah, 1 minute, yeah.
Okay, sure. The litigious nature of competition law meant a lot of these cases were wrapped up for 10 to 12 years in some instances, and where there was potential for some downstream firm industries to be able to grow, those capabilities were eventually lost over some time. Maybe I'll skip through to the last part since I have one minute. But what we then, I think, what we ended up with is what would be a conceptualization of competition or optimal competition that would support a more productionist agenda. And here we say that bringing production back in requires starting from the objective of building shared productive capabilities and generating competition and recognizing the creative functions of markets. So in competition law spaces, you hear a lot of times that we protect competition and not competitors, but you do need competitors in order to have competition. And so this is about really looking and zoning in on understanding what the competitive process is and how you can support that process rather than focusing on the static efficiencies, which is what we've seen. And there are alternatives of this. So for instance, in Germany, they have ordoliberalism. And of course, there's the famous example that's used in Amsden and Singh, which is in South Korea, which is really about the balance between industrial policy and competition policy or antitrust. And this really focuses and zooms in on understanding both the horizontal and vertical relationships between firms and understanding the kind of incentives that need to be created for firms to invest in long-term projects that would support economic growth in the long run. Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela. That was brilliant. And I think it's great to see increasingly this combination of competition, industrial policy, understanding how these things are strongly interrelated. And thanks again to both of you and Fiona also for joining in a day which is holiday. I would use also this occasion to say that we are lots of the content that you presented is also part of a longer project that is now materializing in a volume with Oxford University Press, which will be out in the summer. So we will be hearing, if you're interested on that, we will have a chance to keep discussing these issues in probably a few months with another event. And of course, it's also very important, this issue of looking back at the work of people like Ajit Singh and Alice Amsden, who were trying exactly to have this much more dynamic efficiency perspective on competition and structural transformation. One of the things that we could not miss in an analysis of productive transformation was very much also understanding how conditions for investment have been changing as a result of large financialization. And here, of course, the work of scholars like William Lazonik are very much foundational in thinking how financialization, it's not simply about the economy, it's about what happens within firms, the extent to which firms reinvest and are able to keep up a certain type of level of productive capabilities, development and learning, and of course, innovation. Sophie van Huellen from the Department of Economics at SOAS, University of London, is our next speaker, who is going to present a joint paper on potential for upgrading in financialized agri-food chains with a case from the Ghana cocoa sector. Sophie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antonio. And also thank you to Ha-Joon for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this excellent special issue. Congratulations to you both. Yeah, as Antonio said, this is a course paper with Fuad Mohamed Abubakar, who is working for CMC, the Cocoa Marketing Board in Ghana, and his input, of course, has been pivotal in giving lots of details to the particular case study we're looking into. So the paper itself looks at, or we try to answer the question of what does financialization do in terms of hindering or preventing functional upgrading or opportunities for functional upgrading. So to what extent does financialization open new opportunities, and to what extent might it close opportunities for functional upgrading? So that was the starting question. We then looked at different dimensions of financialization, basically two different dimensions. One is how financialization has changed the modus operandi of large multinational corporations, both in how profit is being generated, how profit is being reinvested or not, as well as how these corporations are competing. The other level that we looked at in terms of financialization was more on the level of global finance, and that's where some of the debates about currency hierarchies came to the forefront. So what does it mean to operate with a currency that is not part of the top currency hierarchies, is not a national reserve currency? What does it mean to be a small open economy in that context? So these two dimensions we looked at in terms of how do they hinder and promote the opportunities for functional upgrading, in particular looking at the cocoa chocolate sector in Ghana. The reason why chocolate or cocoa is particularly interesting in the context of Ghana is that the cocoa sector plays a very important role in terms of reserve accumulation, or the accumulation of financial reserves, or access to financial reserves by the Guinean Central Bank. And that's linked to a particular mechanism in which contracts for cocoa are being used in order to obtain US dollar funding via the international markets. Ghana is one of the few countries who hasn't liberalized its cocoa board. That means Ghana itself has an absolute monopoly via the cocoa marketing board, or the cocoa board in short, via the cocoa marketing company, which is a subsidiary of COCOBOD, to sell cocoa beans that are grown, produced in Ghana. So there's a monopoly, and that monopoly is being used in order to then use these contracts with multinational buyers to access cheap US dollar funding, which then reaches the Guinean central bank. So the way we looked at this was twofold. And the first, what does it mean that now multinational corporations will operate and compete quite differently from what they might have done previously in the financial sphere? What does it mean for new companies to enter into these markets? What are the hindering factors there? What are the factors that promote functional upgrading? And then also, what does it mean for a government to promote functional upgrading? So what's the scope to actually do that? And might that be beneficial or not for that economy? The conclusion was the following. So we identified conflicting forces on both of these levels. The first conflicting force on the level of the multinational companies and the ability for local processing, local higher value addition, and eventually chocolate production was in the sense of financialization at the level of multinational corporations has promoted the establishment of primary processing in Ghana. So these companies are now more willing to relocate some of the more messy, more inventory intensive parts of the production process, which involves primary processing, into areas such as, or into locations such as Ghana, so basically to outsource these activities, which then allowed kind of a medium level processing capacity to be built in Ghana and also other cocoa producing economies. However, the level on how competition is taking place now predominantly in the financial sphere does not allow these companies or hinders these companies to move beyond that level of primary processing into the actual chocolate production and brand name generation to some extent. So both promotion to some level, but then locking these countries or risking to lock these countries into a middle processing or middle value added trap. On the level of international finance, again, we have two forces. One is we know that Ghana, like a lot of other middle and low income economies, are dependent on primary commodity exports, and that has all sorts of ramifications for macroeconomic management. So it's imperative to diversify away from the export of primary commodities and to promote a primary processing domestically. But at the same time, these exports are the main source for foreign reserves, which are urgently needed, even more needed if you are a primary commodity exporting dependent economies, in order to manage your market economy and buffer against the volatility of commodity cycles. So again, there's kind of different forces which pull in and pushing towards primary processing. How that eventually ended up in the policy space of Ghana is that Ghana promotes very heavily primary processing of cocoa to a particular level, which is the semi-finished level, very low value addition activities. And these are geared exclusively for export. They're geared exclusively for export because they still reserved to generate foreign reserves. Now, in order to, or we at least argue that in order to build up a domestic chocolate industry, there needs to be a level of, the domestic market needs to be explored first, before then we can expand into the regional market and then into the international market. For this to be feasible, policies have to change. And that also means we would have to redivert or divert some of the cocoa income away from the international market, away from exports, and therefore also foregoing some of the US dollar reserves that would be earned otherwise. Now, this is not a feasible policy strategy. That's not the case. That's not a feasible strategy for Ghana. It's also not a feasible strategy for most primary commodity exporters. What we're suggesting instead as a policy solution is to exploit the existing system, which is a monopoly forward selling system by the Cocoa Marketing Board, which is a subsidiary of the state-owned Cocoa Board, that actively promotes the domestic processors and also chocolate producers by forward selling some of their produce, therefore guaranteeing the US dollar income and then giving the remaining profits, which are also in US dollars, to use them for generating slowly and building up slowly a domestic chocolate producing sector. And there are existing success stories in Ghana. So Ghana has a very long history of chocolate production. It has capabilities, it has comparative advantages. It produces chocolate that can withstand very high temperatures and is therefore able to expand into regions and geographic regions which have very kind of tropical climates. So there's a lot of potential there in terms of capabilities. And some companies have recently emerged out of this relationship between, a very productive relationship between CMC, which is the cocoa marketing company, and that particular chocolate producer, which emerged out of primary processing. So we're suggesting to actively use this example to promote such processing or such interplay to slowly build up a domestic chocolate producing sector, and thereby overcoming step by step some of the constraints that would otherwise be faced by financialization. That's basically it.
Thanks, Sophie. Thanks. That was brilliant. And I think
to you, Antonio.
Very much reflect also this invitation of trying to understand the link between these micro, meso, macro dynamics, especially in economies where these sectors are strategically important also from the macro point of view in terms of the capacity to generate resources to reinvest in the economy and to develop, upgrade this supply chain. Also, I'm particularly pleased because what you found with your co-author is that sometimes we tend to overestimate lack of capabilities, right? You know, that's the same thing we find in the context of South Africa, and you know, goes back to the work that also Sanjay Alal and others in the 70s were trying to point out, right? You know, there are capabilities here and there are pockets of capabilities that can be leveraged. And sometimes we need to identify what is actually constraining this capability from delivering the type of structural transformation we are talking about. So thanks so much for that. And of course, all this discussion is around production, needed also to engage with the problem of how we engage with industrial policy, innovation policy, but of course, also sustainability and green industrial policy. And there is an increasing amount of research now on how do we make value chains more sustainable, how do we use the value chain framework to think also about sustainability and greening of technologies, production processes, and development of markets. So the last paper by Gwendolyn Anzolin and Amir Debjoy is going to actually provide some insights on this last dimension that we have put for the special. Amir, you're welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Antonio, and thank you for Ha-Joon for having coordinated the special issue, and to all the other authors for the inspiring work. So yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to briefly present this paper jointly written with Gwendolyn Anzolin from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission and the IAPP on the 3 dimensions of green industrial policy in the context of climate change and sustainable development. So the reason Gwendolina and I started this work was precisely a result of our joint frustration that the discussion, global discussion at policy and at the academic level on climate change has mostly been focused on consumption while often neglecting production. And therefore we wanted to bring structural transformation into the climate change debate in line with the spirit of this special issue. And even critical perspectives such as degrowth tend to reproduce this emphasis on consumption while neglecting production, with the argument that we need to reduce or shift consumption towards greener products and cleaner energy sources. But we observe a surprisingly scant attention devoted to what shifting to a greener consumption means in terms of the transformation of productive structures. So the challenge of climate change mitigation goes beyond consuming less, as it also involves producing differently to sustain low carbon consumption patterns. In that sense, the role of green industrial policy is of central importance. And we reviewed and built on the growing scholarly work that investigates the synergies between environmental sustainability and economic development. But we have noticed that although the term green industrial policy is becoming increasingly popular, what it actually means remains unclear. The term means different things to different people. And we therefore identified three main approaches to classify the different kind of dimensions of green interventions. The first one is the consumption-centered approach, which is focused on the individual consumption. The second one is the firm-level sustainability approach, which emphasizes resource efficiency in existing supply chains. And the third one is the productionist innovation-driven agenda, which entails the development and manufacturing of low-carbon technologies. And our main message here is that all three dimensions are essential and highly interconnected in the process towards a more sustainable social and economic model. In other words, it's not just one of the approach over the others, but actually all three. The best green industrial policies are the ones who are going to coherently cut across those three dimensions. And each of those dimensions alone have strong limits, right? So the first dimension enables to change consumer behavior, which can have an impact on production through the power of consumers on the governance of buyer-driven value chains. But consumer behavior is unlikely to change if the cost of changing consumption towards greener products is too high, or if suitable alternatives are lacking. And it might even have an even impact on lower income groups, as seen in France and Ecuador. The second dimension can help deliver the same final goods with less emissions and waste, entailing some changes in production systems without having to change consumer preference. But these policies, have a clear limit without complementary investments in R&D for new technology to improve resource efficiency. Even if we basically promoted retrofitting, right, with existing technology, we would reach a limit, right, and it would not be enough to meet Paris goals. The third dimension takes into account the production side of climate change mitigation, thereby making production structures more compatible with sustainability. But first, they might be difficult to achieve in some countries that lack pre-existing technological and institutional capacity. But also, this line of thought is often used to shed attention away from all the action that we can do now, right? The idea that new technology will come up, we don't need to do anything, it's going to be fine. But the idea that all three are needed, and all three are needed also to scale up low carbon technologies and make them more cost efficient by notably changing consumer behavior in line with technology that is currently being developed, as done in Europe, LED lighting and solar and many other technologies. Now, something else that we found is that the third dimension is one that developing countries rarely address, right? And this matters because most of the industrial opportunities associated with the green transitions might be located in the third one. And we show that by using the case of Ecuador, which is often portrayed as a successful case of energy transition. And in some parts, rightly so, but most of the policies have emphasized the first and second dimension, which means that the country is a case of energy transition without industrial transformation, right? And also due to the lack of coherence across the in terms of policies across the different dimensions. So in sum, what Alice Amsden and many other scholars that are present today have identified in terms of the broader trends dominating anti-poverty policies that are oriented towards consumption while ignoring production jobs are also evident in the climate change mitigation debates. However, we argue and shown that for countries, including and especially developing countries, aiming to seize the industrial technological employment opportunities that stem from green transition, the third dimension of our matrix is of particular importance and needs to be carefully timed, coordinated, and aligned with first and second dimension policies. The accumulation of productive capabilities, including the foundational innovation capabilities that Mateus, and Maria, Sophie, Fiona, and the others mentioned today, required towards the export of green goods and services, therefore remains a very important agenda in the context of 21st century development. Thank you.
Thanks, Amir. Thanks. That was very, very important as also connecting some of the dots that we've been putting together. In a sense, the emphasis on the production side is not simply, cannot be underestimated or replaced by talking about innovation or other things that are, of course, very much part of that, but are not completely addressing the productive dimension, productive transformation also in the greening space. John, I think you have now the floor for a round of comments and reflection before we open to the floor.
Thank you, Antonio. First of all, again, very good papers and very interesting, and they apply some interesting methodology. So I will try to keep it a little bit broad and to make us think a little bit about what we can use this type of work for going forward. Starting with the first paper by Ha-Joon, I think this is very interesting to use these types of case studies to understand the development, what types of policies worked, what types of policies didn't work for the specific industry. So, but what are the insights we can actually gain from for this, for possible predictions, forecasts for development, let's say big push policies going forward in certain types of industries, in different markets, in different contexts. So how much of this development can we actually use in an African context? And that leads me to, for example, some of the other papers that we just discussed. What amount is government failure versus that we have not focused on the right type of analytical framework to understand the dynamism across sectors within the economy, and what is basically government failure. I will come back to that with the second paper. I really enjoyed your presentation, Pamela, and I'm hugely interested in the South African economy. And I think the conclusion that comes out of the paper is also very, very interesting. But again, I will then talk a little bit about my experience that I have in Vietnam, where I think there's also policy failure, and there has been a lot of the same issues that we are facing here in South Africa. But one thing that I noticed is that in the South African context, we often do not really discuss whether it's the government that is slow to get out of bad policies compared to, for example, Asian cases. I'm talking about the fence breaking policies in Vietnam. And we have seen, there has been a paper showing that 5 out of 4 policy initiatives and industrial policy initiatives in Vietnam has failed. But the one that succeeded was hugely successful. So are we discussing whether governments are bad at leaving bad policies quick enough? I'm talking about, for example, not being able to separate competition law and industrial policies, so that they are not able to combine those. Should they be quicker in realizing this and starting to do this? I get the conclusion from the paper, and I really support this, but are we also missing, is there a missing link that we do not understand in terms of industrial policy? What role does government failure play in all of the things that we're discussing now? And that will lead me to Sophie's paper, and I think this is very interesting, but it's also what I call very interventionist ideas. And again, could that be a concern in Ghana, in a specific industry? How successful has the Ghanaian government been in implementing other types of interventionist ideas like this? So maybe we should discuss that a little bit deeper or more thoroughly. So you can see all the comments I have here is related to maybe Ha-Joon's paper about we shouldn't neglect the issue of the government willingness to change policies quickly when we talk about industrial policy as well. So that is the main issue that I have here. Antonio, if you allow me just to deviate a little bit, because I would like to also highlight, because I see a lot of young people here in the audience. And I would like to refer to the journal, so the European Journal of Development Research a little bit. We have an early career initiative that is basically helping you can say, or assisting young scholars in promoting their work and assisting them with improving their papers to fit a journal like the European Journal of Development Research. Currently, the European Journal of Development Research has an impact factor of 1.93, so it's quite highly ranked for a development journal of this sort. And it has, since Spencer took over and very prominent people have been a part of the journal, not me, but I can talk about some of my colleagues that are doing an immensely good job, that we have been able to create a journal where we allow for special issues like this one. And if you go back in time, you can actually see that young scholars have also been able to start special issues and get them accepted by the journal to promote their work going forward. So I really encourage you to consider the journal, especially the young staff here or the young scholars here, because you can say we get them preferential treatment in some sense to the journal in part of the issues. Of course, it has to be of a certain quality. That is no doubt about this, but we do acknowledge the age difference between people that enter into the journal. Okay, and I just wanted to highlight this. Thank you, Antonio.
Thanks, John. Thanks. I think it's a very good way to close your comments, talking about infant industry protection and helping developing learning and capabilities. I'm particularly pleased because I was
exactly
joined the editorial board, so I double your invitation to have more integrated research communities with young, more senior scholars working together on these issues. This is great. So I think we have a few questions that are coming up. We have just 8-10 minutes left. So I'll try to be, as Ha-Joon did in the first round, just to pick up one question that came for Kuhn around when it comes to local content requirements. Developing countries are often very worried about WTO restriction and introducing, of course, local ownership rules. What a country that wants to upgrade beyond just being a low-cost production location do in this context can do. So question around local content, and there were a few questions around also across the panel in terms of the challenge. I would pick this one by Mateus also towards Pamela, which reflect also what something that John mentioned, the challenge of coordinating government interventions across industrial and competition policy. So I'll pick those, but there are more. So as we did before, a couple of minutes to each of the panel just to address these, and I will ask Ha-Joon just to give us a last word. Kuhn, please.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I read this comment, the question in the Q&A box. Yeah, in the paper, actually, I discussed more on local content requirement policy. They all adopted this policy, like Malaysia, Thailand, China, but they all have to give up because of WTO's request. Right? So in other words, they have a same start and same trial, all interfered by WTO. But only China made success. In other words, the best scenario is that you first promote FDI or OEM, but eventually by going through local content requirement or some other measurable learning by local entities, you eventually grow indigenous company. That happened in China, happened in Korea before, but didn't happen much in Thailand or in Malaysia. Okay, so even in Vietnam, they are really the assembly makers of Samsung mobile phone, but they're able to grow a local company called VIN, a locally owned company. So you learn from foreign company FDI. In parallel, you should be able to grow local company. And that's what basically happened in the past Korea and recently China, and maybe happened in Vietnam. Okay. In the Malaysian case too, although they failed in automobile, they are successful in some resource-based sectors. That's my paper with Amir. In other words, in the palm oil or rubber industry, they're able to grow locally owned companies. And they are not, they are high value added and also export oriented. So these are the emerging new source of growth in Malaysia. So Malaysia now is going well, not based in manufacturing, but based on local resource-based sectors. They also kind of not much locally creating value added in the IT sector either. IT sector in Malaysia is same as auto sector in Thailand, MNC dominated, so only limitedly creating local value added, so less successful. But they are successful better, more in terms of those palm oil and resource rubber sectors.
Thanks, Kyun. Thanks a lot. Pamela, please. Pamela, yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John, for the comments, and Mateus for the question that you sent in. And I think there are two main points that I'd like to make around these questions, which are a little bit linked, one could say. So in terms of your question, John, on, is the government being slower to get out of bad policies and changing and adopting new policies? Work that we've done that will actually be reflected in the book that that Antonio mentioned has showed that the distribution of power within the economy doesn't actually support the diversification of capabilities. So there's a lot of power, and particularly economic power, linked to the existing structure of the economy. So there's little, incentive from the powers that be to actually move away. And so this makes it a little bit more difficult for government to then drop the bad policies. And actually the Competition Act makes a perfect example of this. Some of the recommendations that we're making now were actually part of the initial draft of the 1998 Act that was drafted. However, that draft was taken to NEDLAC, which is a platform where government, business, and labor negotiate policies. And through that policies, a lot, particularly of the abuse of dominance provisions, were watered down because influenced by the power of business. I mean, in combination, of course, with dominant policy paradigm that was happening around the time. I think the Washington consensus was very strong when South Africa was just coming into democracy and was creating these policies. But there's also a linked aspect of this, which is what Antonio raised, which is government coordination. So instead of seeing more coordination in South Africa over time, we've seen more fragmentation of government. We've seen the creation of multiple government departments that would effectively be dealing or arranging the same thing. So industrial policy sits with, I actually can't even tell you the number of different departments. And this was in part done in order to facilitate corruption. And what I've argued with Simon, one of the co-authors, in a different piece, is that this in part flows from the kind of exclusion that the majority of the population feels, because the system was created to preserve the status quo. So all those that were outsiders felt increasingly excluded, to the point that some, and in political circles that had some political power, then caught on to the idea that the only way to be able to accumulate any wealth is by breaking the rules. And then hence sorry.
Thanks, Pamela.
So two dynamics that are at play, at least in the South African context.
Thanks so much. Thanks. Sophie.
Thank you, John, for the comments. I agree the conclusion is a bit interventionist. The rest of the paper, not at all. It just focuses on the analysis. There's an issue of generalizability. So I think the trade-offs that I described are very common across commodity-dependent economies. And of course, there's lots of heterogeneity across these economies as well, and differences whether they're agricultural based or they're more energy based. But these trade-offs do exist for a great number of countries. However, the solutions are very specific to Ghana. So that's not something that can be replicated in another economy. It's very much context specific. To the question of what's the appetite of the current government when it comes to interventionist policies, it's huge. So the current president of Ghana has a very, very strong agenda of enforcing almost processing and also chocolate production domestically. So he threatened recently Switzerland of saying that he's not willing to trade any more unprocessed cocoa beans with the global north, if you want. So they're very much concerned about this, and it's key point on the policy agenda. The struggle at the moment is that we have two different forces within government which are struggling around these issues. One is the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank, which depends on these foreign reserves. The other one is Cocoa Board, and both of the, so the Ghanaian Cocoa Board, both of them are very, very, very strong political segments. So the Ghanaian Cocoa Board is not a small ministry or small player when it comes to government. It's a huge player. So I would say they have almost equal power when it comes to negotiating the terms of these policies. The suggestion that CMC does forward sell some of the primary processed products is not something that is a suggestion, it's something that is happening already for some of the domestic processors already. So this is something that has already been implemented. The suggestion on tax dropping the tax for chocolate is something that will be more difficult to implement, and that's still, I think, a discussion which is very much open to debate domestically. But yeah, there's a huge appetite, amazing appetite. Resources at the moment due to COVID and the commodity crash / COVID situation, heavily indebtedness, is a bit questionable. Sorry, Antonio.
Now, I would like to give also Amir the chance for his 1.5 minute remark. Amir, please.
I don't think I received any comments or questions. So
feel free to, if you want to have a final remark, feel free, and then I'll pass to Ha-Joon quickly.
Well, maybe one very short final remark kind of looking forward on this agenda is the notion of sustainability and green sectors in general. There is a sector that traditionally the field of industrial policy has not necessarily looked at, but is very important nowadays, especially as the new generation of students that when they hear about industrial policy, usually the cases that they hear about are cases of kind of sectors that tend to be polluting and so on, and they don't associate it with something, a tool that can serve as a solution of moving forward to address today's challenges, right? And that's a fallacy, because obviously those state interventions can be used for different sectors and to address as well different like the sustainability issues. So I hope that this is an agenda that is kind of increasingly taken forward by the developmentalist, neo-Schumpeterian, and industrial policy literature.
Thanks, Amir. I would just say one word as my last remark. I'm particularly pleased that also in this second round, we have realized from many of the comments in the discussion that production is political, it's not a technical exercise. And this is, I think, also something that increasingly we need to factor in our analysis, moving beyond a quite dry version of understanding what happens in terms of productivity, innovation, technological change. All these things have a fundamental political nature that has to be understood as part of this technical and material transformation. So thanks everyone for that. And I'll pass to Ha-Joon for the very last word.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to say one thing. I think that what has emerged from the research that was done for this special issue is that we really need to understand the granularity, if you like, of individual situations, because our studies have shown that exactly what policy involving which actors working on which domains that is a good one depends on what the country is, at what level of development, what types of capabilities does it have, what are the resource endowments, and then also what it wants to achieve. I mean, is it leapfrogging or kind of redesigning the energy system, or is it breaking into the new markets? So I think that what we would like to kind of encourage the contributors and also the people who have come to this seminar is to really think about policy intervention in this kind of context dependent and fine-grained way. And I think our theoretical frameworks that we have developed in this special issue really help us do that, because that you know, by definition, the domain of production is characterized by, you know, the singularities and, you know, the minute differences and so on between different activities. You know, that in the market, everything, I mean, probably shouldn't be, but that gets reduced to some kind of comparable monetary unit. But when it comes to production, you know, every technology, every sector, they have their unique features, and the kind of theoretical frameworks that we have developed in this special issue really help us see that, and hopefully that should encourage us to enable us to engage in the policy debate in this more kind of sensitive way, rather than just discussing whether government should intervene or shouldn't intervene. I mean, we have, I mean, including myself, wasted far too much time having that debate. Yeah, so that let's hope that this special issue can allow us to take the debate to another more productive level.
Thanks so much. On this productive note, thanks everyone for joining us, and hopefully keep safe, and we will be in a further conversation soon.